They tested Earth's gravity, and their soldiers' bones shattered instantly. The transmission came while I was eating breakfast. Not the dramatic kind of breakfast you imagine for a moment like that. No panoramic window overlooking a city. No uniformed officer standing at attention behind me. It was a bowl of oatmeal going cold on my desk, a half-drunk cup of coffee sitting next to a stack of unread reports, and me, Calvin Hurst, staring at a blinking red light on my communication terminal that I had been pretending not to notice for the last 4 minutes. I pressed accept. The face that appeared on my screen was not human. It never had been in all the months I had been assigned to this desk. High Commander Varric of the Veth Dominion looked exactly as he always did, tall even in transmission, his bone-pale skin almost translucent under the ship lighting, his 4 narrow eyes arranged in a vertical line down the center of his face. He had no nose, only 2 slitted openings above a mouth that moved in ways a human mouth never could. When he spoke, the translation software caught up about a half-second later, filling his silence with a voice that sounded like a man reading legal documents in an empty auditorium. Diplomat Hurst, the translation said. The Veth Dominion extends its final address to the administrative body of the planet, designated Earth. You have had 40 of your days to review the terms of transition. The Dominion has been patient. The Dominion is no longer patient. I picked up my coffee. It was cold. I drank it anyway. High Commander, I said, setting the cup down slowly. I appreciate the follow-up. Varric's 4 eyes did not blink. They never blinked. The terms are not a subject for continued discussion, Diplomat. They are a record of what will occur. You will surrender administrative authority to Dominion-appointed governors. You will reduce surface activity to designated labor zones. Landing preparations will begin in 30 of your days. I nodded, as if he had just told me my lunch reservation had been confirmed. I will pass your message along to the relevant parties. There are no relevant parties, Varric said. There is only compliance or consequence. Then he closed the channel himself, which he always did, because the Veth never gave you the satisfaction of being the one to end the conversation. I sat back in my chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then I picked up a different phone, the one with no official label on it, the one that connected to a line I was not technically supposed to have. And I called General Owen Price at the Unified Earth Defense Coordination Center in Oslo. He picked up on the first ring. Did they set a date? He asked. No greeting. Owen never wasted time on greetings. 30 days, I said. They used the word landing preparations. There was a short pause, not the kind of pause that means someone is thinking, the kind that means someone already knows exactly what they are going to say and is deciding how much of it to share. Good, Owen said. I had known Owen Price for 11 years. We had served together in the 3rd Pacific Security Rotation before either of us ever imagined something like this would be our reality. He was not a man who smiled easily, and he was not a man who used the word good lightly. When he said it now, with that quiet weight behind it, I felt something shift in my chest. Not fear, not relief, but something in between. The feeling you get standing at the edge of something very high, looking down, knowing you are about to jump and knowing, for the first time with real certainty, that you will not fall. Owen, I said. Tell me we are ready. Calvin, he said. We have been ready for 6 months. We were just waiting for them to commit to a date. The Veth had been circling Earth for 19 months by then. They arrived with 11 warships, which their own broadcasted transmissions described as a diplomatic presence. We later learned from intercepted Veth communications that a diplomatic presence, in Veth terminology, meant a force large enough to destroy a planet's major population centers within 4 hours if negotiations went poorly. They were very casual about that distinction. The first 3 months had been genuine diplomacy, or something close to it. We sent representatives. They sent translators. We exchanged data on biology, history, language structure. They were not especially interested in any of it. What they were interested in was resources. Earth had water in quantities that the Veth, coming from a dry system, found almost incomprehensible. We had dense forests, mineral-rich ocean floors, and an atmosphere that, while not comfortable for Veth physiology, could sustain Veth-modified agricultural production. They had done their math. The math pointed to Earth being worth taking. What their math did not include was anything about the surface conditions. I had noticed this gap in their 3rd data exchange packet. They had asked for population counts, distribution maps, infrastructure layouts, and resource yield estimates. They had not asked about atmospheric pressure at surface level. They had not asked about tidal forces, seismic activity, or gravitational measurements. At the time, I thought it was an oversight. I was wrong. It was not an oversight. It was simply an assumption so fundamental to their worldview that they never thought to question it. They had visited 14 planets before Earth. Of those 14, 10 had surface gravity lower than their homeworld. 3 were comparable. 1 was slightly higher. None of them had come close to Earth. The Veth homeworld, which they called Veth Ori, using a word that translated roughly as the quiet ground, had a surface gravity of about 4 meters per second squared, just under half of Earth's. Their entire civilization, their biology, their architecture, their military equipment, their understanding of what a planet felt like to stand on, all of it had been built around that number. They had looked at Earth and seen a prize. They had not seen a trap, because in 19 months of observation, it had never occurred to a single one of them that the ground itself could be a weapon. I had not told them, nobody had. That was not an accident either. Owen had come to me 8 months earlier with a classified briefing that I was not supposed to receive but received anyway, because Owen had a habit of trusting the right people at inconvenient times. The briefing described a surveillance event from month 7 of the Veth presence. A Veth scientific vessel had detached from the main fleet and entered low Earth orbit under the stated purpose of atmospheric sampling. While in orbit, it had deployed a small probe to the surface, a compact unit about the size of a large backpack, carrying Veth scientific instruments and a single Veth crew member in a pressure-sealed suit. The probe had landed near an unmanned weather monitoring station in northern Canada. The crew member had stepped outside. The Canadian weather station had a motion-activated camera. The footage was 12 seconds long. In it, you could see the Veth crew member step off the probe's landing platform and take 3 steps onto the snow-covered ground. On the 3rd step, the suit's leg supports collapsed inward. The crew member went down sideways, and the suit, which had been engineered for Veth Ori gravity, simply could not compensate for what Earth was asking of it. The automated distress beacon activated within seconds. The probe sealed and launched back to orbit with the crew member still inside. The Veth filed no report about this incident. None of their public transmissions mentioned it. They acted as though it had never happened. We had the footage. Owen had the footage. A small team of physicists, biologists, and military engineers had been given that footage and 12 weeks to answer one question. If a fully equipped and suited Veth soldier tried to operate on Earth's surface, what would happen? Their answer was delivered in a report that ran to 67 pages, and the summary on the first page was only 2 sentences long. The first sentence said, "A Veth soldier in standard combat configuration, operating on Earth's surface without specialized gravity compensation equipment far beyond current Veth engineering, would experience structural failure in the skeletal load-bearing systems within minutes of surface exposure." The second sentence said, "They do not have that equipment, and there is no evidence they know they need it." I had read those 2 sentences 4 times before I turned the page. Then I turned the page and read the rest, and by the time I finished, my oatmeal was cold and my coffee was cold, and I had the clearest, most unsettling understanding of a military situation I had ever held in my entire life. The Veth were coming to take our planet, and the planet was going to take them apart. Owen had been calm about it in that first meeting. He was always calm. He sat across from me in the secure room under the Oslo facility with a styrofoam cup of terrible coffee and explained, in the even voice he used for everything from weather reports to catastrophic intelligence assessments, that the decision had been made at the highest levels of Earth's unified defense structure to allow the Veth to believe the negotiations were proceeding normally, to allow them to plan their landing, to allow them to commit troops and equipment and timetables, and then to let them land. "You want to let them land," I had said. It was not a question. I was just confirming that I had heard him correctly. "We want them to make the first move," Owen said. "If we fire on their ships, we start a war, we fight in space, and we lose. If we tell them about the gravity, they adapt. They build better suits. They take longer. They come back harder. And they come back with the knowledge that we were hiding something." He set his cup down. "But if they land, if they choose to land, on their timeline, with their soldiers, their equipment, their commanders watching from orbit, then the situation teaches them something that no diplomat or general ever could." I looked at him for a long moment. "It teaches them that Earth is not like anywhere they have ever been. It teaches them," Owen said quietly, "that we do not need to fight them at all." I went back to my desk after that meeting and I sat for a long time without doing anything. Outside the window of the Oslo facility, the city was going about its day. A tram ran past on its schedule. 2 people walked a dog along the riverbank below. A child on a bicycle was being helped by what looked like her father, both of them laughing at something. The sky above was gray and low and completely ordinary. I thought about how that child would never know how close it had all come to being taken away. I thought about how that dog would never know that the most important military decision in human history had been made, in part, based on 12 seconds of footage from a Canadian weather camera and the skeletal density charts of a species that had never once looked at our world and asked what it was like to stand on it. Then I picked up my phone and called Varric back. I told him Earth was reviewing the terms. I told him we appreciated the Dominion's patience. I told him we would have a substantive response within 30 days. He believed me. They always believed me, because they had decided, somewhere in those first months of contact, that we were not sophisticated enough to deceive them. They had 14 conquered planets in their history. They had a pattern for how this went. We were step 15 in a sequence they had run 14 times before, and every step had gone the same way. And why would step 15 be different? I hung up. I looked at my cold oatmeal. I thought 30 days. I thought they have no idea. And then I finished my breakfast. Because whatever was coming, it was going to be a long few weeks, and there was no point in starting them hungry. The 30 days passed in the way that important time always passes. Too slowly when you were waiting, and too quickly when you were preparing. I sat through 46 meetings in those 30 days. I signed documents I would not be able to describe to anyone outside those rooms for at least a decade. I transmitted carefully worded non-answers back to Varric twice a week, each one designed to sound like progress while being, in substance, nothing at all. And I watched. I watched the feeds from the monitoring stations. I watched the Veth fleet hold its position beyond the lunar orbit, patient and enormous and completely confident. I watched Owen's teams run their final drills and distribute their final equipment and move into their final positions. I watched the world outside my window keep turning, keep living, keep existing in that stubborn, heavy, ordinary way it always had. On day 29, Owen called me. They've transmitted final coordinates for 3 landing zones, he said. Siberia, the Saharan interior, Western Australia. All 3 of them remote, all 3 of them low population. The Veth had chosen carefully, in their way. They wanted the landing force to secure ground before moving toward the population centers. Standard approach, based on 14 previous operations. Are we set? I asked. We have been set for 6 months, Owen said. Calvin, get some sleep tonight. I did not sleep, but I tried, which I suppose counts for something. On day 30, I woke up before sunrise, made coffee that was actually hot for once, and sat at my window watching the sky lighten over the river. Somewhere above that sky, 11 Veth warships were preparing to send their soldiers down to the surface of a planet they had never truly studied, to conquer a species they had never truly respected, on a world whose single most basic physical property, the invisible, constant, absolute force pressing down on every living thing that had ever drawn breath on this planet, they had never once thought to ask about. I drank my coffee. I waited. The first landing craft broke atmosphere at 6:47 in the morning. I want to tell you that I had always known humans were different. I want to tell you that growing up, I had some early understanding of what we were, what the weight of this world had made us. But the truth is simpler and stranger than that. I grew up in a small town in West Yorkshire, the kind of place where the big conversations were about football results and whether the new roadworks were going to block the high street for Christmas. My father drove a delivery lorry for 22 years. My mother taught secondary school geography. On weekends, we walked in the moors and complained about the mud and ate sandwiches in the rain because that was just what you did. Nobody ever sat me down and said, Calvin, you are the product of 4 billion years of survival on one of the most physically demanding planets in the known galaxy. Nobody told me that the reason I could carry a 40-kilogram pack for 20 kilometers without stopping, the reason my bones had density readings that surprised every military medical examiner who reviewed them, the reason I had recovered from a fractured tibia in 11 weeks when the standard projection was 16s. Nobody told me that all of that was Earth talking. It took an alien invasion to make me understand what my home had always been doing to me. I was 12 years old when I fell off a dry stone wall on the edge of the moors above our village. I was up there with my friend Peter Crane, because Peter had decided, with the complete confidence available only to 12-year-olds, that there was a shortcut to the farm where his uncle kept horses, and that the shortcut involved climbing over a wall that turned out to be much less stable than it looked. The wall gave way and I went down about 2.5 meters onto the rocky ground below. I hit my shoulder, my hip, and the side of my head. I sat up and checked my limbs, the way my father had taught me, and found that everything moved. Peter was white-faced at the top of the broken wall, convinced I was dead. I was not dead. I was bruised in places that stayed purple for 2 weeks, and I had a ringing in my ear for 3 days, and then I was fine. The doctor who examined me said I was lucky. Looking back now from where I sit, I do not think it was luck. I think it was the cumulative weight of my species' history, pressed into every cell of my body by a planet that had been doing that pressing for a very long time. Consider what Earth demands of its inhabitants. Every living thing on this planet, from the smallest insect to the largest whale, has been shaped by a gravitational pull that is, by the standards of the inhabited galaxy, exceptionally strong. We did not know this for most of our history, because we had nothing to compare ourselves to. We simply lived here, and were shaped here, and went about the enormous task of surviving here, without any cosmic context to put it in. The context came later. The context came when the Veth sent their survey data and Owen's teams began to cross-reference it with what we knew about the galaxy's inhabited worlds. Of all the planets with confirmed complex life that humanity had so far, cataloged through its own and borrowed astronomical surveys, Earth ranked in the top 8% for surface gravity. Most life evolved in gentler conditions. Most life never had to develop the internal architecture to move comfortably under this kind of weight. Human bones are extraordinary. I do not say that to boast. I say it because our own biologists had been trying to explain it to military planners for years before the Veth arrived, without anyone paying serious attention. The femur alone, the large bone running through your thigh, can withstand a compressive force of roughly 1,700 kilograms in a healthy adult before it will fracture under direct pressure. Astronauts who spend extended time on space stations lose bone density at measurable rates because the body, in the absence of gravity, stops maintaining what it no longer needs. The moment you take the weight away, the body begins to let go of the architecture that weight demanded. Now flip that. Imagine an entire species, the Veth, that evolved under half the gravitational pull of Earth. Their bones were not weak exactly. They were perfectly suited for their world. They were optimized for Vethori, for its pressures, its demands, its physical expectations. They were simply never built for here. The Veth combat suit was a marvel of Veth engineering. I say this without any irony. The suit incorporated powered movement assistance, atmospheric filtration, impact dampening, and communication systems that our own military engineers spent 3 weeks admiring in their classified reviews of the captured technical data. It was, for what it was designed to do, a genuinely impressive piece of technology. What it was designed to do was allow a Veth soldier to operate on Vethori, or on any world with comparable gravity, in a hostile environment. The movement assistance motors were built around the assumption that the suit would need to compensate for perhaps 20 or 30% more load than a Veth soldier would carry naturally. The structural supports in the legs were calibrated for loads that, on Earth, would be exceeded in the first moment the soldier stood upright. We knew this because 3 months before the landing date, Owen's team had obtained, through channels I was not briefed on and did not ask about, a complete technical schematic of the standard Veth combat suit. They ran it through engineering analysis. They asked a very specific question: at what point does this suit fail under Earth's surface gravity? The answer came back in hours. The leg support structures would be operating at 240% of rated capacity. From the moment the soldier stood up, the spinal support column would be at 310%. The suit was not designed to fail gracefully. It was designed to assist motion, and when the load exceeded its tolerance, it would not gently slow down. It would lock, buckle, and transfer the full uncompensated weight of a suited Veth soldier directly to the body inside. A Veth soldier, unsuited on Earth's surface, would be managing a weight roughly 2.5 times what their musculoskeletal system had ever been asked to manage. Unsuited, they would not be able to stand upright for more than a few minutes before the compressive forces on their lower spine exceeded safe structural limits. Unsuited, the simple act of walking would place loads on their hip joints that their joints had never evolved to handle. Suited, with the suit failing, it would be faster and more direct. I want to be clear that nobody at any level of our planning took pleasure in this knowledge. I want to be clear because it matters. The meetings I sat in during those 30 days were not triumphant. Owen did not stand at the front of briefing rooms rubbing his hands together. The scientists who ran the analysis did not celebrate their findings. There was a very serious, very heavy silence that settled over every room where this information was discussed, because the people in those rooms understood exactly what it meant. It meant that 40,000 Veth soldiers were going to come to Earth, fully believing they were beginning a standard planetary occupation operation, and the ground was going to do to them what ground has been doing to things that were not built for it since the beginning of time. We were not going to stop them. Stopping them required firing on their ships, and firing on their ships meant a space engagement we could not win. Our orbital defense grid was good, genuinely good, better than the Veth seemed to have estimated, but it was not good enough to destroy 11 warships in a single engagement, and even if it had been, what came after? The Veth Dominion had 14 conquered systems. They had resources and shipbuilding capacity and a military tradition stretching back further than our written history. A space war with the Veth Dominion initiated by Earth was not a war. It was a very brief and very terrible ending, but a landing force that destroyed itself on the surface of the very planet it came to take. That was a different kind of message. That was a message that went beyond Earth, beyond this conflict, beyond the specific question of whether humanity survived this particular encounter. That was a message to every other species in the Veth Dominion's expansion path, to every other world that the Veth had catalogued as a future acquisition, and to the Veth themselves. That was the message that said, there are places in this galaxy that cannot be taken. There are worlds that defend themselves without lifting a single weapon. There are species you have not yet learned to read. Be careful which doors you open. I had a long conversation on day 14 of the 30 with a woman named Helen Marsh. Helen was the lead xenobiologist on Owen's planning team. She was small and precise and wore her gray hair short, and she had spent the previous 4 years studying every piece of biological data the Veth had shared in their initial information exchanges. She knew more about Veth physiology than any other human alive, including some things the Veth had not intentionally shared. We sat in a small conference room with terrible lighting, and she walked me through, very quietly and without any drama, what the medical projections for the landing force looked like. The first failures would come fast, she told me. The moment the soldiers stepped off the landing craft, the suit systems would begin struggling. Within the first few minutes, the powered movement assistants would be drawing maximum power to compensate for the load. Within 10 to 15 minutes, the suit systems would begin to heat from the strain. The structural failure points she identified were specific and sequential. First the knee, support brackets, then the hip stabilizers, then the lumbar columns. She explained each one with diagrams. She was matter-of-fact about all of it, in the way that doctors are matter-of-fact about painful things. Not because they do not care, but because being matter-of-fact is how you carry knowledge that is heavy in its own right. Will they understand what is happening, I asked. Not at first, she said. Their suit monitoring systems will read it as equipment malfunction. They will not immediately connect it to the gravity differential, because the gravity differential is not something they have been briefed to consider. Their mission parameters will tell them they are experiencing a technical failure of their equipment, and they will attempt to compensate, and the compensation will accelerate the failure. She paused and looked at her diagrams. By the time their command structure understands what is actually happening, she said, it will be too late to extract the majority of the force. I looked at the diagrams for a moment. How many will make it back? Helen was quiet for a few seconds. If they begin emergency extraction within the first 20 minutes, and if the extraction goes perfectly, and if their pilots fly the craft back to orbit faster than their standard safety protocols allow, perhaps 15%. I thought about that number for the rest of the meeting and for several days afterward. 15%. Out of 40,000 soldiers. I told myself what Owen had told me in his quiet, steady way when I raised the same question with him. I told myself that the Veth had made this decision. They had received every opportunity to negotiate. They had been given 30 days, and then more days before that, and months of open channels and diplomatic exchange. They had chosen, with complete certainty and zero doubt, to come here and take this world from the people who lived on it. They had looked at Earth and seen property. They had looked at humans and seen labor. They had never once looked at either of us and seen something that could refuse. That was their choice. Everything that followed was the consequence of that choice. I believed that. I still believe it. It did not make the number easier to sit with. On the evening of day 28, I went for a walk along the river in Oslo. It was cold and clear, and the streetlights were reflecting in the water, and a couple of teenagers were sitting on a bench sharing headphones and ignoring the cold with the absolute indifference to weather that teenagers have always had. I walked for an hour without going anywhere in particular. I thought about my father driving his lorry through West Yorkshire rain. I thought about my mother drawing geography maps on a whiteboard. I thought about Peter Crane at the top of that broken wall, convinced I was dead. I thought about the 12 seconds of footage from the Canadian weather station, and the Veth crew member who had taken 3 steps and gone down, and the automated beacon that had pulled them back to orbit before the planet finished what it had started. 3 steps. That was all the data the Veth had about Earth's surface, and they had buried it, and they had come anyway. I went back to my room and I looked at the ceiling, and I thought about Helen's 15%, and I thought about Owen's quiet voice saying, "Good," and I thought about the child on the bicycle who would never know any of this was happening. Then I closed my eyes and waited for morning. The landing craft broke atmosphere in 3 separate streams, each one aimed at its designated zone. I watched them on the monitoring feeds from the secure room in Oslo. 7 of us around a table, with screens and coffee, and the particular silence of people who are watching something that cannot be stopped, and would not be stopped even if it could. Owen sat at the head of the table. He had not slept. You could see it around his eyes, but his hands were still, resting flat on the table, and his voice when he spoke was exactly as it had always been. "Siberia contact in 4 minutes," said the technician monitoring the northern feed. Nobody responded. There was nothing to respond to. The craft were on their approach trajectories. The landing forces were fully suited and, according to the intercepted Veth communications our intelligence team had been tracking since the fleet's arrival, fully briefed on their mission objectives: take ground, secure the perimeter, hold position for secondary forces. Simple, familiar. The kind of operation the Veth had run 14 times on 14 other worlds. I watched the thermal signatures of the craft on the satellite feed. They were large vehicles, each one carrying between 300 and 400 soldiers, in addition to equipment and support systems. 40,000 troops spread across 3 continents, all of them believing they were doing something routine. "Siberia first contact," the technician said. The craft settled onto the frozen tundra in a broad basin about 60 kilometers south of the nearest monitoring station. The landing itself was clean. Their pilots were competent. The craft came down level and firm, and the deployment ramps dropped within seconds of touchdown. On the ground-level camera feed, a surveillance unit that Owen's people had positioned 18 months earlier specifically for this moment, disguised as a geological survey marker. The ramps opened and the first soldiers came out. They walked in organized columns. Even at that distance, even on that camera, you could see the precision of it. They moved the way a well-trained military force moves. Purposeful, spaced correctly, equipment checked and positioned. They stepped onto the Siberian snow and kept moving. For about 45 seconds, nothing unusual happened. I know that seems like a short time, 45 seconds, but I want you to understand what those 45 seconds felt like in that room. We had been building to this moment for 8 months. We had worked and planned and prepared and waited, and now we were watching. And for 45 seconds, the Veth soldiers walked onto our planet and did not immediately fall down. And in that room there was a kind of held tension that I had never felt before and have never felt since. Then the first column stopped moving. It was not dramatic at first. The lead soldiers slowed, then halted. The column behind them compressed slightly, the way a line of traffic does when the front car unexpectedly brakes. On the intercepted audio, our team had been tracking Veth military communications on encrypted frequencies that we had broken in month 11 of their presence. There was a burst of short transmissions. The translation came across on a secondary screen in short phrases: suit system alert, load compensation at maximum, something is wrong with the movement restriction in lower. Then a different voice, louder, carrying the cadence of someone giving orders: do not stop, move forward, equipment malfunction protocols, continue the advance. The column tried to move forward. The soldier at the front of the column went down, not violently, not like a movie. He simply went down the way a very tired person goes down, sideways and then onto his face, with none of the automatic catching that a healthy body normally does when it starts to fall. The 2 soldiers behind him stopped. One of them went down a moment later. The third reached down to attempt to help the first and staggered under the shift in his own weight, distribution, and his right knee buckled, and then there were 3 of them down in the Siberian snow. Around the table in Oslo, nobody spoke. On the feed, the entire column was beginning to slow. You could see it. Soldiers stopping, leaning, some catching each other, some not. The organized formation of 3 minutes ago was dissolving in real time, and I could hear on the audio the change in the communications. The orders getting sharper, the responses getting more fragmented. Individual transmissions beginning to carry a quality that the translation software rendered as urgency and confusion, but which I would simply have called fear. "Sahara contact," the technician said from the right side of the table. I looked at the second screen. The scene in the Saharan interior was different in details and identical in substance. The desert landing had been even cleaner than Siberia. The flat terrain gave the craft a perfect surface, and the Saharan deployment had proceeded with textbook speed. The soldiers moved out in their columns across the hard-packed sand, and for about 50 seconds they kept moving. Then the same pattern, slower, stops. The front of the column going down, the middle of the column compressing, the rear of the column beginning to halt as communications from the front came back, indicating something was wrong. On the Sahara audio, a voice I had come to recognize over months of intercepted transmissions, the VETH operational commander for that zone, a senior officer whose rank translated roughly as strike commander, came on and said with great clarity and great firmness, "All units do not stop. Equipment malfunction is being assessed. Continue the advance by any means available." By any means available. I thought about those words for a long time afterward. The soldiers in the Sahara tried to comply. Some of them crawled. I do not use that word to diminish them. They were soldiers following orders in a situation their training had never prepared them for, doing the only thing their discipline allowed, which was to keep moving toward the objective regardless of the cost. Some of them crawled across the desert sand, dragging the weight of suits that had stopped helping them, and were now simply weight, trying to reach a perimeter line that was receding in importance with every passing second as the situation became clear. They could not do it. The load was too much. The suits were not holding. Without the suit's support, the bodies inside them were carrying weight that those bodies had never been engineered to carry. And bodies do not argue with physics. They simply fail. "Australia contact," the technician said. I did not look at the third screen immediately. I was watching the Siberia feed. I was watching because the soldiers in Siberia had reached the point, about 9 minutes after landing, where the organized column structure had entirely dissolved. What remained was scattered, clusters of suited figures in the snow, some still, some moving in very small ways, a few managing a slow and painful forward progress that I recognized, with a hollow feeling in my chest, as determination. Pure, stubborn determination applied to a situation that determination alone could not resolve. On the Siberian audio, the zone commander was no longer giving advance orders. He was giving extraction orders, short, fast, targeted at the pilots still aboard the landing craft. "Begin emergency extraction protocols. All vehicles, begin emergency extraction protocols." The pilots responded. The landing craft began to power up their vertical lift systems. But the soldiers on the ground could not make it back fast enough. Some of them were too far from the craft. Some of them could not move enough to close the distance. The craft descended their ramps and a handful of soldiers. Those close enough, those who had not gone down yet, managed to get back aboard. The craft lifted. On the feed, the tundra below held what it held. Suits in the snow. Some moving, some not. Owen's hand on the table pressed flat. I watched him look at the feed for a long moment. He picked up his radio. "Begin medical deployment," he said. "All 3 zones, full team protocols." That was the part the VETH had not anticipated at all, I think. That we would send medical teams. That, the moment their soldiers were down and their craft were lifting, we would be mobilizing rescue and medical units to go out onto that tundra, into that desert, into that Australian plain, and provide care to the soldiers of the army that had come to take our planet. Owen had insisted on it from the beginning. When he first laid out the operational parameters 8 months earlier, the medical deployment was not a secondary concern or a political gesture. It was a core component of the plan. "We are not doing this to hurt them," he had said. "We are allowing them to demonstrate the consequences of their own decisions. What happens after that is our responsibility." Some people in those early planning meetings had argued against it. Not cruelly. Most of the people in those rooms were not cruel, but practically, resources, risk, the question of whether it would be misread. Owen had not argued back. He had simply said, "This is what we are doing," and that had been the end of it. On all 3 feeds, the emergency extraction was completing. The craft were lifting from Siberia, from the Sahara, from Australia. The audio from all 3 zones had gone from ordered military communication to something much more raw, much less structured. Voices reporting numbers, officers confirming counts. The particular silence in a military communication that comes after a number is given. Nobody repeats it back. "What are we looking at?" I asked the technician. She checked her screen. She was young. I had not known her before these 30 days. And I realized I did not even know her full name. Only that Owen had assigned her to this room, and that she had been professional and steady throughout everything. She looked at the numbers. "Siberia. The craft lifted with about 42% of the force aboard," she said. Her voice was very level. "Sahara, approximately 38%. Australia, 47%. I did the math without wanting to. Out of 40,000, the remaining percentages, the ones not on the lifting craft, were still on the ground. Our medical teams were already moving. On the intercepted fleet communications channel, High Commander Varric came on. He did not use the calm, measured translation voice of our diplomatic calls. He spoke fast, and the translation software took longer to keep up, rendering his words in slightly broken sequence. Explain this. All zone commanders, explain this immediately. What is the malfunction source? What is the enemy action responsible for? And then a voice I did not recognize, speaking Veth in a different register, one that the translation software flagged as scientific advisory. The voice said very clearly, the words that I knew were going to change everything. High Commander, there is no malfunction. There is no enemy action. It is the gravity. The surface gravity of this planet is 2.4 times the gravity of Vethori. Our suits were not rated for this load. Our soldiers were not. Our soldiers cannot. A long pause. Then Varric's voice again, and even through the translation software, even through the half-second lag, I could hear what was in it. Why was this not in the survey data? The scientific advisor did not answer immediately. When the answer came, it was short. Because we did not measure it. The room in Oslo was very quiet for a moment. The screens showed 3 empty landing zones. The medical teams on the ground feeds were moving in their vehicles, spreading out across the tundra, across the sand, across the red Australian earth. The Veth fleet held its position above us, enormous and still and, for the first time since its arrival, silent on every channel. Owen looked at his flat hands on the table. Calvin, he said, get ready. They are going to call you. He was right. The call came 11 minutes later. I answered it in the same room I had been answering every call for 19 months. My cold coffee was back. My hands were steady. The screen lit up and Varric's face appeared. And for the first time in 19 months of calls, his 4 vertical eyes did not hold the comfortable weight of a being who considers himself to be entirely in control of the situation. He looked like someone who had just been handed a calculation that changed every other calculation he had ever made. Diplomat Hurst, the translation said, and then it stopped. For 3 full seconds nothing followed. I waited. Diplomat Hurst, Varric said again. What has happened to our soldiers? I looked at him for a moment. Then I said, very calmly, the thing that I had been carrying for 8 months. High Commander, I said. They landed on our planet. The Veth flagship was called something that translated, roughly and imperfectly, as the deep current of authority. I had seen it on long-range feeds dozens of times during the 19 months of their presence. An enormous, elongated vessel, dark-hulled, built in the low-gravity aesthetic of a civilization that had never needed to make anything sturdy enough to bear its own weight in strong gravity. It was beautiful in its way. Long, sweeping lines, structures that branched like coral, surfaces that would not have lasted a week exposed to Earth storms. I was brought aboard it in a sealed transfer pod, alone. No guards, no diplomatic staff, no weapons. Just me, Calvin Hurst, former soldier and current least important seeming man in the most important meeting in human history, in a gray suit that I had worn to 46 briefings in 30 days, and that needed to be cleaned. The inside of the flagship was cold by human standards and dim by human standards and too tall by human standards. Corridors designed for beings who had evolved under half Earth's gravity had a different geometry. Lighter structures, higher ceilings, narrower floors. Walking through it, I was aware at every step of how much I weighed. My footsteps were too loud in their corridors. My posture was too upright. I was, in a very literal sense, too much of everything for this space. The Veth crew members I passed in those corridors did not look at me with hostility. They looked at me the way you look at something that has just revealed itself to be quite different from what you believed it to be. There was something in their four-eyed gaze that I can only describe as recalibration. Varric met me in a room that was clearly designed for formal proceedings. It had the high ceiling and the careful spatial arrangement of an official chamber. Around the central table sat 8 Veth in various categories of formal attire, including 2 who wore the indicators of senior scientific rank and one who I recognized from months of communication monitoring as the Veth Dominion, Sexpedition Logistics Commander, the person responsible for planning the landing operation that had just concluded the way it had concluded. I sat down. The chair was too tall for me in the Veth way, which meant my feet did not quite reach the floor, which I found I did not mind at all. Varric stood at the head of the table. He was, as always, controlled. Whatever he was feeling in the last 2 hours had given him a great deal to feel. He was not going to display it openly. That was a kind of discipline I could respect, even under the circumstances. Diplomat Hurst, he said. Before any other matter is addressed, I must ask a direct question. Of course, I said. What weapon did you use against our soldiers? I had known this question was coming. I had thought about how to answer it for months, off and on, In the in-between spaces of meetings and walks along the river and cold breakfasts at my desk, I had a prepared answer. I had a diplomatic answer. I had a careful, measured, precisely worded answer that had been reviewed by 17 people. I did not use any of them, I said. No weapon. High Commander, your soldiers were injured by the planet. The room was quiet. The two scientific advisors exchanged a look with each other that passed too quickly for me to read. Clarify, Varric said. Earth's surface gravity, I said, is 9.8 meters per second squared. Your homeworld's surface gravity is approximately 4 meters per second squared. The difference is roughly 2.4 times. Every piece of equipment your soldiers carried, and every physical structure your soldiers' bodies contained, was designed for Vethori's gravity. None of it was rated for Earth's. I said it plainly. I did not embellish it. I did not add anything. One of the scientific advisors, the older one, whose rank indicators I could not precisely read but whose bearing suggested seniority, made a sound that the translation software rendered simply as acknowledged. In the way you acknowledge something that you have already begun to understand, but needed to hear said clearly. Varric looked at me for a very long moment. You knew this, he said. Yes, you knew this and you allowed the landing to proceed. Yes. Another silence. The logistics commander, who had been still since I sat down, shifted in a way that in a human would have indicated suppressed emotion. Why, Varric said, did you not simply tell us? This was the question I had spent the most time with. Not the answer was straightforward. But the question itself, the genuine, unguarded quality of it, the way it came from Varric not as an accusation but as something approaching honest confusion. That was the question I had, turned over in my mind more than any other. Because you would not have believed us. That was the true answer. Because you had looked at us and decided what we were, and no amount of data we gave you would have changed that conclusion. Only your own experience could change it. But I did not say that, I said. High Commander, in 19 months of diplomatic exchange, your Dominion made clear that your presence here was not conditional on our cooperation. You stated your terms. You declined to modify them in response to our concerns. You characterized this as a transition, not a negotiation. In that context, what information would we have given you that you would have accepted? Varric looked at the table. Then he looked at the scientific advisors. Then he looked back at me. You could have told us about the gravity, he said. We could have, I agreed. And you could have asked. That landed in the room the way a stone lands in still water. The impact, and then the spreading out from it in every direction. The scientific advisors were very still. The logistics commander looked at the table. Varric's 4 eyes did not blink, but there was something in the set of his face that shifted. He had sent 40,000 soldiers to a planet whose most fundamental physical property he had not measured. Not because the measurement was difficult, not because the technology to make it was unavailable, but because it had never occurred to anyone in the Veth Dominion's extensive, thorough, well-documented expedition planning process to ask the question. That was the weight in the room. Not what had happened, the reason it had happened. Your medical units, Varric said after a moment. They are on the surface, yes. Treating our soldiers, yes. A pause, why? Because they needed treatment, I said. And we have medical units. He looked at me for a long time. I looked back. I tried to look like what I was, a person from a planet that had just been invaded by his fleet, sitting across from the commander of that fleet, offering to treat the soldiers that planet's gravity had injured. I do not know what Varric made of that. The Veth had not encountered this particular response in their 14 previous planetary acquisitions. What do you want, Varric said, finally. We want what we have always wanted, I said. To be left alone, he was quiet. We are not interested in territory in your systems, I continued. We are not interested in your resources or your subject worlds. We have no demands regarding Veth internal affairs. We want a formal treaty of non-interference, binding on both sides, witnessed by whatever legal frameworks the Dominion uses for such agreements, that recognizes Earth as an independent world, outside Dominion authority, not subject to Dominion claims now or in the future. I paused to let the translation catch up. In exchange, I said, we will provide full medical support to your personnel currently on our surface. We will return your soldiers to your ships as soon as they are stable enough to transport. We will not publicize the details of today's events to any third parties without your knowledge. And we will not fire on your fleet as it withdraws from Earth's system. The last item on that list was the one that did the most work. We had not fired on their fleet. We had not fired on anything. In every technical and legal definition that the Veth Dominion used, Earth had not engaged in hostile action against the Dominion forces. The Dominion fleet had arrived, declared terms, landed troops, and sustained significant casualties. all without a single weapon being deployed against them by the defending planet. In Veth military law, which our intelligence team had spent months reconstructing from public and semi-public Dominion records, this created a specific legal situation. Casualties sustained in a landing operation where no hostile action was taken by the defending party were classified as operational failure, rather than combat loss. The distinction mattered enormously within Dominion command structure. It meant the expedition had not been defeated, it had failed, and failed expeditions under Dominion military law could not be used as justification for escalated response. Our legal team had identified this window 8 months ago and had built every subsequent plan around it. We had been extraordinarily careful, in every aspect of the operation, never to fire a single weapon, not because we lacked weapons, because the legality of our position was the strongest weapon we had. Varric stood at the head of the table for a long time. His scientific advisors were conferring in very quiet, very fast Veth on a side channel that our translation software caught as fragments. The logistic commander had gone to what I can only describe as the Veth version of a faraway look, the expression of someone running numbers, and not being happy with what the numbers said. Then Varric said, "Your medical team's on the surface. Are they transmitting data on the condition of our personnel?" "Yes," I said. "I can arrange for that data to be forwarded to your medical command." He nodded, slowly. It was the first time I had ever seen Varric nod. They were not natural nodders. Their yes gesture was a slight lateral tilt of the head. But he had clearly spent enough time watching human diplomatic feeds that the nod had become available to him as a gesture. He used it now with a strange kind of deliberateness, as if he were making a decision about more than just the question I had answered. "I will need to consult with the Dominion Council," he said. "Of course," I said. "We are in no hurry." He looked at me when I said that. 4 eyes, arranged vertically, with all the alien quality they had always had, but with something behind them now that had not been there in any of our previous conversations, something that looked, in however translated in unfamiliar a form, like respect, not warmth, not friendship, not yet, and perhaps not ever, but the particular, specific kind of respect that you can only give to something you have underestimated. He said, "Your world is very heavy, Diplomat Hurst," I said. "Yes, High Commander, it has always been. 5 years have a way of making extraordinary things feel ordinary. I think about that sometimes, how the brain smooths everything out, how the event that was going to define the rest of human history has become, for those of us who were there, just a thing that happened. Just a very large, very consequential thing that happened, the way large consequential things eventually settle into the part of your memory that stops feeling urgent." The treaty was signed 4 weeks after my meeting on the deep current of authority. It was not a simple document. It ran to 312 pages in English, and roughly twice that in Veth, and it was reviewed by legal teams on both sides for more than 20 days before a single signature went on it. Owen sat next to me at the table where it was signed, in the same Oslo facility where we had watched the landing feeds. He wore the same gray jacket he had worn for all 46 planning meetings. He did not make a speech. He simply signed his name in the space provided and passed the pen to me. I signed. The Veth delegation signed, and that was, for all practical purposes, the end of the invasion of Earth. I say for all practical purposes because the official end, in Veth legal terms, required the approval of the Dominion Council and the formal reclassification of Earth in the Dominion's planetary registry. From candidate, acquisition to non-interference zone. This took another 11 weeks. During those 11 weeks, the Veth fleet remained in its position, though no further communications of a threatening nature were transmitted, and no further landing attempts were made. They simply held position, quietly, waiting for their own bureaucracy to catch up with the new reality. On the day the reclassification was confirmed and transmitted to us, Owen called me at home. It was early evening in West Yorkshire, where I had gone for a week because I needed to see something that was not Oslo, not a secure room, not a diplomatic transmission screen. I was sitting in my parents' kitchen. My mother was making tea. My father was watching a football match on the television in the other room. Owen said, "It is done." I said, "I know." He said, "How is Yorkshire?" I said, "Wet." He made a sound that from Owen Price was the closest thing to a laugh available to him, and then he said goodnight, and I put the phone down. My mother set a cup of tea in front of me. She did not know the specifics of what I had been doing for the past 20 months. She knew it was diplomatic work. She knew it was important. She knew I looked tired. She sat down across from me and wrapped her own hands around her cup and said, "Are you all right, love?" "Yes," I said. "I think so." She looked at me for a moment, the way mothers look at their children. when they know there is more to be said and are deciding whether to ask. Then she said, "That job of yours, is it sorted?" "Yes," I said, "it's sorted." She nodded and drank her tea and left it at that in the other room. My father cheered at something on the television, and the sound of it was so completely normal that I sat there for a moment and just let it be what it was. The world outside was dark and raining, which in West Yorkshire is most evenings in November. The kitchen smelled of the tea and whatever my mother was planning to cook for dinner. The ceiling light was the same slightly too bright bulb that my father had replaced 3 times in my memory without ever buying a slightly less bright replacement. I was home, and home was still here, and that was something I had not been able to take for granted for 20 months, and I sat in it for a moment with the full weight of gratitude. I became Earth's permanent ambassador to the Interstellar Council 18 months after the treaty signing. It was not a role anyone had held before, because the Council itself had not existed before. It was one of the outcomes of the Veth situation, a formal diplomatic body created when the Veth Dominion, in the aftermath of the Earth incident, found itself reconsidering the governance of its expansion programs, and several of its subject worlds used the moment to request independent representation. The Council met on a neutral station in the outer belt of a system I will call the Median, because the Veth name for it translates to something with too many syllables for casual use. The station was built by a coalition of engineers from 4 different species, which meant it looked like nothing anyone had specifically intended, and everything 4 different architectural traditions had produced by accident. It was a genuinely remarkable place. I had an office there with a window that looked out into the nothing of deep space, which was an extraordinary thing to eat breakfast in front of, and which I never entirely got used to. The work was different from the Oslo days. Not better or worse, different. More procedural, more patient, more focused on the long accumulation of small agreements than the one enormous decision. I was good at it, I think, because I had spent 2 years learning the most important thing any diplomat can learn, which is the difference between what someone says and what they have decided. The Veth sent their own ambassador to the council, a woman whose rank translated as senior counsel, whose name sounded, to human ears, like Saya. She and I worked across from each other for 4 years and found, slowly and without either of us particularly intending it, that we worked well together. She was precise, and I was patient, and between us we could cover most situations. She never asked about the invasion directly. It was there between us the way large things that are over are between people. Present, referenced sometimes obliquely, not avoided but not reopened either. About 8 months into our working relationship, one of the Dominion Council members, a Veth of senior rank whose attitude toward the Earth Treaty ranged from resigned to resentful depending on the session, asked me, in the middle of a council discussion about expansion protocols, whether humanity intended to develop offensive military capability for use in interstellar space. It was not an innocent question. It was a political question, and everyone at the table knew it. I said, Earth's military capacity is, and will remain, directed entirely at the defense of Earth in its immediate orbital space. We have no interest in projecting force beyond our system. The council member said, and if the Dominion or any other power should decide that the Earth incident was an anomaly, that a better prepared force could succeed where the first landing failed. The room was quiet. I thought about Owen. I thought about Helen Marsh and her 67-page report and her matter-of-fact diagrams. I thought about the 12 seconds of footage from the Canadian weather station. I said, I would encourage any such power to take a very careful look at the survey data before making that decision. Specifically, the gravitational data. In our experience, people who read that number carefully tend to revise their plans significantly. Saya, across the table, made a gesture with her left hand that I had learned. Over months of working with her, meant something like agreed or noted, or perhaps more precisely, that point is settled and we may move on. It was not a big gesture. It was very quiet, but I saw it. Afterward, as the council session broke and the room began to clear, she fell into step beside me in the corridor. Diplomat Hurst, she said. Ambassador Saya, I said. I have a question that is personal rather than official. Of course. She walked beside me for a few steps before asking it. She had a thoughtful way of walking. Saya. She moved like someone who was always slightly aware that the floor was not as heavy as it should be. Does it hurt, she asked, your planet, living under that weight every day? I looked at the corridor ahead of us. The lights of the station were warm by deliberate design. Someone in the coalition of architects had understood that artificial environments need warmth even when nothing about them is natural. No, I said. Or, not in the way you mean, it is just what home feels like. You stop being aware of it. She was quiet for a moment. I have been studying human biology, she said, for the past 3 years, informally. My own reading. I know, I said. She looked at me and I said, Saya, you have made 37 specific references to human bone density and cardiovascular adaptation in our various conversations. It was not subtle. She made a small sound that I had learned was the Veth equivalent of being caught at something. I find it remarkable, she said. The degree of adaptation. 4 billion years of building toward that specific set of conditions. We are stubborn, I said. You are heavy, she said. And there was something in her voice that I could only describe as wonder. In every sense. We walked to the junction where the corridor split toward our separate offices. She paused before turning. The soldiers, she said. The ones from the landing. I waited. Many of them recovered fully. The ones your medical teams treated. I thought you should know that. I'm glad. I said. I meant it. Some of them, she said, have become advocates within the Dominion for the expansion review protocols. The ones who were there. They are not angry, or perhaps they were initially. But they are not now, she paused. They say the planet did not seem to want to hurt them. It simply did not accommodate them. I thought about that for a moment. Saya, I said. That might be the best description of Earth I have ever heard. She turned her head slightly, which was her acknowledgement. Then she walked toward her office and I walked toward mine. I sat in front of my window and looked at the stars for a while. The council station was positioned so that from my window, on clear cycles when the station's external lights were reduced for scheduled maintenance, you could see Earth's sun as a specific star. Not the brightest thing in the field of view, not the largest, just one star among many, completely unremarkable from this distance. It was remarkable to me. I thought about the child on the bicycle in Oslo, who still did not know any of this had happened. I thought about my mother's kitchen, and the too bright ceiling bulb, and the rain on the window. I thought about Peter Crane at the top of a broken wall, convinced I was dead, and me sitting up on the rocky ground below and checking whether my limbs still worked. They had. They always had. I thought about what Saya had said. The planet did not want to hurt them. It simply did not accommodate them. And I thought that this was true of Earth in a way that was not just physical. This was the thing about a world that has been heavy for 4 billion years. It does not develop its weight as a defense. It does not grow its density as a weapon. It simply is what it is, completely and without compromise, and what it is happens to be precisely the kind of place that breaks the things that were not made for it. We had not built a weapon. We had not designed a strategy, not in the deepest sense. We had simply been what we were, lived where we lived, and let that mean what it meant. The stars outside did not move. They never do, or not on any timescale a person can see. The Veth Dominion had spread the account of the Earth incident through its own diplomatic channels, initially as a classified operational report and then, as the treaty settled and the politics shifted, as a matter of public record. Saya had told me once that the account was studied in Dominion military academies now, not as a defeat, which in the strict legal sense it was not, but as a lesson in a category they had created specifically to hold it. She had said the Veth word for the category, which the translation software rendered as something close to unknown environmental lethality. I had laughed when she told me. She had asked why. Because that is exactly what home is, I said. Unknown environmental lethality. And we love it. She had given me the caught at something sound again. And then she'd said something that I have thought about many times since. She said, "You are the only species we have ever encountered that speaks about the thing that could most easily harm them, as though it were a source of pride." And I had said, "It is the thing that made us. Of course it is a source of pride. There are things I do not know about the future. There are other species out there, in the dark between those stars, whose survey data I have not read, and whose planets I cannot name, and whose intentions are not yet legible to anyone on Earth or in the Veth Dominion's files. There is more universe than any of us has mapped, and more of it is occupied than we know. And some of what occupies it will eventually find its way to a blinking red light on a terminal in front of someone who has a bowl of cold oatmeal and a difficult question to carry. What I know is this. Earth is 4.5 billion years old. It has been shaping life for most of that time, pressing it down, wearing it in, making it dense and durable and complicated in all the ways that life under pressure becomes complicated. Every scar that ever healed on a human body is part of that story. Every bone that ever broke and mended thicker than before. Every muscle that ever learned to work under load. Every generation that survived something it should not have survived, and passed that survival. Forward to the next one. The Veth came to take our planet. The planet was here before we were and will be here long after, doing what it has always done. pulling everything toward itself, insisting on its own terms, refusing to apologize for what it is. They tested its gravity. Their soldiers' bones shattered. And somewhere in the rubble of that terrible miscalculation, the galaxy learned what every child in West Yorkshire who has ever fallen off a dry stone wall already knows. We are not fragile. We have never been fragile. We are what fragile things become when they have had 4 billion years and no choice but to survive. And we are home here, on our heavy, loud, stubborn, extraordinary world, and it is ours.